All right, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today, I'm very delighted, we've been doing this series on comprehensivism, along with our folks, friends from Philadelphia like CJ. And we've been covering a whole range of topics. Like last Wednesday, we had Karen talking about art experience and art education, how art education that we have, her whole point is that we have two wings. We are individuals, we have to be authentic individuals, and we are connected to other people. If you're afraid, you stop being yourself and you don't connect deeply to other people. So art education helps you expand both these wings to be more authentic, real individual and be yourself and connect deeply to other people, and you can fly. So that was her point. This Wednesday, Sanjay is going to be talking about neuroscience and what we can learn from neuroscience about our habits. The Wednesday after that, John Roth will be here. He'll be discussing the four cardinal virtues. And he'll be talking about how they have been portrayed in visual arts and stories and mythologies to provide this kind of what Leonardo used to call common sense, where the point hits you from multiple senses. So that's what is coming up. And given that we are focused on this topic, I am particularly delighted to have Bob and Michele Root-Bernstein here. They have been polymaths all their lives, and they've been studying polymaths. So I'm really, really excited about this interview. So welcome, Bob and Michele.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So let's dive into it. What is a polymath? How is a polymath different from, let's say, a dilettante or a specialist?
Good.
You want me to do that?
Yep.
Yeah, we don't know who's going to talk. Well, actually, that's exactly the kind of question we were addressing in a recent paper. Actually, several recent papers, but what we've tried to distinguish is the dilettante is someone who's interested in many, many things and kind of flutters from one to the other, but doesn't necessarily try to build a network connecting those interests. There's no singular focus that pulls everything together for that person. So they're just interested in many, many things, and they follow that along. And they may or may not be professional about it. What we're interested in is more the person who's got many interests, but they are connected in that person's mind anyway, and in their practice, they're connected in a way that they feed each other creatively or imaginatively or skill set or whatever. There's some reason that they're pursuing these multiple interests because they often have a singular focus or a problem that they're addressing that has many aspects to it, so they're kind of exploring the many aspects. So basically what we come down to is that a creative polymath, someone who's using their wide interests in a way for some kind of creative outcome for them, whether it's personal or professional. That creative polymath is pursuing multiple interests, whether avocationally or avocationally, doesn't really matter, and they're consistently pulling them into their sense of purpose or network. Did I miss something in that definition? Yeah.
Excellent. I mean, the way in which Buckminster Fuller puts it, it's kind of breadth and depth in the sense that they're able to go broad, but then they're able to bring it incisively on whatever it is that they are focused on. A dilettante goes broad, but doesn't actually do anything. And it doesn't bring together all those interests. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's really a combination of looking for common principles and practice, putting it to use in some way.
Okay, so that brings me to the next question. You talk about kind of universality of creative process. That's a very, I think that's core to this idea of polymath. So talk a little bit about it. In what way is this process universal? How did you discover that it is universal? What are your thoughts on that?
I guess, so this is what actually got me into what we could call polymath studies. I was in college at Princeton. Most of the people I had as friends were, you know, a science major or a law major or whatever it happened to be, but they were also an artist, played in the orchestra. Many of them were athletes as well and so forth. They did many things. And I got the definite sense that they saw this as part of a holistic life. And then I got admitted to graduate school, also again at Princeton, but I changed fields. And the president of the university gave a introduction to, or, you know, welcome to the new class of graduate students, where he said, basically, we know that you're all, you know, broadly interested in many things and you're very talented people, et cetera, but here's my message. To be able to succeed professionally, you must put on blinders. And he literally said that. You must put on blinders and do one and only one thing for the rest of your life.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there going, one, this doesn't fit my personal experience. It certainly didn't describe my parents, who were quite successful. It didn't, you know, and then I was even thinking about the president himself. How the heck do you become a president of a university with all of the different things that you have to do as a, you know, I mean,
Right.
a huge number of different skills you need if he did only one thing, you know. So this made no sense. So I ended up partly just from that personal reason, but then also for professional reasons, looking into whether that was true. And the professional side was I was getting a Ph.D. in history of science. And the people I was studying were people like Charles Darwin. You can hardly imagine a more broadly trained person across every possible science and social science. And then putting that all together, Louis Pasteur, who was actually considered one of the best amateur portraitists in France. Numerous, you know, people, while he was still a teenager, had written about him as an artist before he ever became a scientist. And it became clear that he was using his art in his science. And so I'm reading about all these different people and going, this is not the message that we are getting. The specialization thing is certainly a way to succeed, but clearly it's not the way to succeed. And the people I'm looking at who are perhaps the most successful people in history don't fit this mold at all. So I started looking specifically at why are these extremely successful people doing these broad ranges of things? And often this is, while they are professionals, they're also, you know, working as artists. I started meeting Nobel Prize winners who, you know, were having art shows or performing in orchestras or even cutting records and things like that, while they're doing their Nobel Prize winning work. You know, why would you, quote, waste your time doing this? And so a lot of the skills, the techniques, the methods that they would talk about then fed into the book we were talking about earlier, Sparks of Genius. It became clear that they were using a common skill set and a common process. And that then got me in trouble with the academics, because in academic studies, you know, people were literally saying that, you know, science and art share absolutely nothing. They do not have any interactions that are valuable, specifically from the art to the science and things like that. And yet here I am interviewing Nobel Prize winners, reading people's autobiographies, and they're saying, so, you know, I developed this skill of visualization through my artwork. I developed my ability to decide what a good piece of science is through the aesthetics that I developed as a musician, because, you know, what's the difference between a technically well-played piece and one that moves you? Well, a lot of scientists will tell you that's the same thing that differentiates a technically good piece of science versus one that changes the field. That aesthetic sensibility of surprise, you know, emotional impact, literally when somebody makes a discovery, as much as we portray scientists as being objective, they're not. Nobody spends 20 years trying to do something simply because it's logically and I'm going to follow each thing through. You have to be absolutely dedicated. And that part gets totally left out unless you ask people specifically about it. So as I went through, what I began realizing is everybody who I was reading who described art and science as being completely different were describing products. No, a written piece of music is not the same thing as an experiment. A poem is not the same thing as a scientific paper and so forth and so on. But when you sat down and asked them about creative process, everybody who looked at creative process, where did you get the problem? How were you inspired to come up with a new idea? What kinds of tools do you need to actually start working through the possibilities and see what their implications are? What kind of skills do you need to communicate those things? All those things that are part of the creative process, everybody who's done both art and science would say, it's exactly the same. And literally they would say that word, exactly the same.
Wow, wow. Michele, what about you? How did you discover, how did you come to this point?
This point? Well, I mean, partly because I was with Bob. When I first met him, I was very much, I was studying to be an historian. I mean, I got a Ph.D. in history of all things, which I never really followed up. And then became very interested when Bob started working on the science art stuff. And, he was doing it as a historian of science at first. But I was very interested in that he was actually, that he could talk about something so interesting, which was process. How do people discover? So that kind of, from the very beginning, interested me a lot. And then when he was actually finalizing, his book on discovering, which was the science art partly the science art connection. And in that book too, he posits the existence of these tools for thinking. And so that was very interesting to me too. And I helped by, editing the book and such like that. So I was very involved in the ideas. And then we'd start, and I'd say, well, gosh, I just read a poet who said the same thing, or, an historian who said the same thing, or whatever. So it would be other fields other than science. And so when he finished that book, we started thinking, well, we'd like to work on this idea of the thinking tools and process, creative process, in a broader way to see if it's not just scientists and artists, it's others. And so basically, that's where I became involved when we started working on Sparks of Genius.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the scientists, because what I found, I studied science, or I thought I'd studied science. And then after I decided that I needed to study everything, I went back and started looking at scientists and their original works and their lives. And it was actually completely different from what I was given to understand as science, because what I was given to understand as science were, exactly as you said, products of their theories. And if you thought the way science is taught, you would never do science. You would never be able to produce the science. So the creative aspect, that the creative process that results in science is completely different from saying that, okay, here is a scientific theory. This is how you apply it to this problem. That's not what science. So and there is a sense of almost childlike joy. And when I studied Darwin, I saw that the connection that you're talking about, like Lyell, Darwin was studying Lyell, geology, and simple point that things that you observe in your everyday life, the same factors, given enough time, can produce massive change. And he got that. And that was there at the back of his mind when he landed on Galapagos and saw all these amazing beetles around. But it flows very naturally. And to me, it's common sense. So, one of the things is that I think having the science base is very valuable, I think. It looks like there are two cultures. Like I'm sure you have thought about this a lot more, but there is a science culture and humanities culture. I find like when people come to my meetups, most of them are either from this or that. There are few of us who can actually talk about both. Not just talk about both, but see critical importance of both of them. Can you talk a little bit about these kind of cultures at a cultural level?
Yeah, so certainly one of the things that I've run into is exactly that problem of there being the myth of two cultures. In fact, one of the strangest things I find is that C.P. Snow, who invents that name, is a very well-known physicist. He is a very accomplished politician, and he writes novels that are still in print. So definitely a polymath. And I actually, at one point, I haven't written this up, but I gave a presentation where I looked at all of his close friends. All of them were polymaths. I mean, very extraordinary ones. And yet he writes this essay where he says, artists and scientists have literary people and scientists have no commonalities and they can't talk to each other. And I'm like, this is very strange because this was not his personal experience, certainly. And what I eventually found was he came to that conclusion because he was in charge of a commission during World War II, which was to look at what you could do with all the scientists in terms of putting them to work for the war effort in Britain. And so they went and interviewed something like literally 40,000 scientists and then tried to figure out what their skill sets were and where do you assign them to industry or military or whatever. I discovered that almost none of them had any applicable skills to anything, which was a real shocker to them. They couldn't communicate. They, unlike American scientists that tend to come out of farms and industrial backgrounds and things like that, where they learn to work with tools and so forth. In Britain, you had to be super intellectual and get into Oxford and Cambridge and things. They couldn't do anything. So that's what he was really talking about. And so it's not so much literature versus science. It's more having to do you have the ability to communicate and use your knowledge practically for something, which gets back to what Michele and I were talking about. We define polymaths. So really the distinguishing thing that we talk about is there are people who know things and there are people who understand things. And the distinguishing point for us is you can know things passively. You can know that something is a Van Gogh. You can know that something is Beethoven. You can, know that, E equals MC squared means something or other. That doesn't mean you have the ability to use it in any, useful way. People who understand things are able to then say, okay, what is it that makes Van Gogh a Van Gogh and different from something else? And let me show you. They can actually implement a style. They can show you the different ways that people use styles, what techniques they're using, those kinds of things. So in that sense, since I do art, I can do that with some art, not all art. Nobody can do this with all arts or all media here, but I don't understand E equals MC squared. Yes, I studied it once, but I don't know what I do with it. I'm not a physicist who understands things like that. And so one of the things that I think we've got wrong, which gets back to your point about what science is we have taught science as knowing rather than understanding. And I was actually once offered a job where I would have been a colleague of two guys who invented, the first definition of what science literacy was, and this was probably 35 years ago. And they basically defined it as, here are the 100 terms that if you can define them, you're science literate. And I mean, literally, they're the only people at a new university, a new department, and I just looked at them and I said, I can't do this. This is just so antithetical to everything that I believe that I turned down an endowed chair at this university because it was just wrong. So I'm still fighting this. I had an experience about 10 years ago where I was talking to a couple of really, really bright students in one of my classes. Two of them worked in my lab. And I said, so, what's insulin? And they told me what it was. What does it do? It helps your glucose get into your cells. Da da da. They can find all that stuff. And I said, okay. I said, who discovered it? And everybody, they all looked at each other and went, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So if you can't tell me who discovered it, how was it discovered? Say World War III occurs, the pharmaceutical industry can't supply your grandfather with insulin. Your physiologist, where would you go to, get your own insulin? They just looked at each other. And I'm like, okay, what discovery can you tell me? That, how it was made, that you could reproduce. And again, they looked at each other and said, we can't, we couldn't reproduce any discovery. And I suddenly realized this was what was wrong. Can you imagine an artist being asked to paint something and saying, I don't know how to paint? And yet we are graduating literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of scientists who don't know how to even replicate the basic things that they're learning about. And to me, that's one of the reasons to study creative process as unifying, because if you don't know how to do it, I don't think you understand it at all.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. Just as a side note, one of my favorite things on how to be a scientist is by this Kajal. He's a neuroscientist, and he wrote a tiny book because he was really upset that Spain had not caught up with science. It's a beautiful book, and it's all about processes. It's about how you need to be in order to do science.
And he was, by the way, the first person to take color photographs in Spain. He set up the first professional photographic shop to sell to other people. He was a phenomenal artist. All this stuff, unfortunately, is held by his family, and they won't let anybody see it. But a few things have leaked out. I mean, he's literally a Leonardo da Vinci.
And short stories.
Yes, he wrote short stories and novels. I mean, the guy did everything.
Oh, I did.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I didn't know any of this. This is fantastic. This is fantastic. I just love that book because it's the most clear-headed. Because what the other thing that happens is that not just about product and process, but there is this entire ecosystem of what you need to get right about your values, about your passions, about how you deal with people. All of it you have to kind of get right in order to be creative. And he this is, he naturally deals with all of this. Like what happens is that I think our world has become too divided into silos. They say, oh, that somebody else will handle. Morality is not my issue. That's their issue. No. All of it is connected. All of it has to work in you for it. So I'm very excited about your book. So I want to talk to you about your book. Let's see where to start. You identify these 13 tools, 13 creative tools. Firstly, just tell me about how you came to write this book.
So basically, it started with my first book, which was Discovering, which was 1989. This was an attempt to look at it started out as what did history and philosophy of science have to say to working scientists? So I've been bridging those two areas for a long time. I have a Ph.D. in history and philosophy of science, but I run a physiology laboratory and do immunological research and things like that. So I was trying to figure out, you've got all these famous people, you've got all these people studying them and what their methods were and so forth, but we never use any of that in our science teaching. What could we do? As I went through, as I said, many of these people turned out to be musicians and artists and poets and dramatists and all sorts of things. So I got excited about, why are they doing all these other things and what brings them together? And as I read through autobiographies and interviews and things like that, it became clear that they understood explicitly what they were doing. And they would say things like, so one of the things my art taught me was how to be a much better observer. So observing is a really critical, function for me. And so then as I was reading through, I go, oh, wow, this person's talking about observing and this person's talking about observing. They don't always learn it the same way or from the same, you know, art or whatever, but there's a skill set here that's associated with observing. And then many of them would say, Ramon Cajal, for example, was one of them. He'd say, you know, it's fine to see everything, and he was a great artist. But when he actually drew the neurons, which, you know, he studied to get his Nobel Prize, none of his drawings were realistic. They're very, very styled, and they're, you know, most of the details have been left out. And he actually writes about this very explicitly, saying, I don't draw everything. He was the first person to take photomicrographs. He could have illustrated all his papers with photographs. He said, I don't, because if I show you what I actually saw, you won't see anything. My object is to let you see what you need to see, and therefore I abstract out, and he uses that word, the essential material. Okay, so abstracting becomes another tool. And again, once I get this idea that abstracting is critical, I see everybody using the word abstracting. Even Heisenberg talks about abstracting. That's really what writing equations is for a physicist, is abstracting out the essence of all these physical principles and putting them down into a simple system. And so that's where these come from, is as I was reading, I'd come across them. So it's literally just from the phenomenology of the whole thing. And this is what Michele and I would have discussions about. I'd come home and say, wow, it's really weird because Heisenberg gives this definition of abstracting that is like exactly what I just read Picasso saying. And she'd go, huh, that's really strange, because I was reading T.S. Eliot or somebody like that, and he goes, here's what the purpose of, you know, poetry is. It's to, you know, get at the essence of it. And it would be, again, almost exactly the same words, and again, defining exactly the same process. So over the years, first I, you know, sort of put it down as here's what I think the scientists are doing. We discuss it. And that became the impetus to write Sparks of Genius, because we began realizing these were not terms that were just like scientists using them or the artists that I was sort of studying on the side, but everybody and everything that Michele was reading as well, dancers and poets and, you know, all sorts of other people, historians, were using exactly the same terms. And we weren't seeing people use this as a common language or understand that they were describing common processes that, you know, linked across fields.
Wow. Wow. Let me what I want to do is I want to look at the problem, because look, I'm very, very passionate about this, because, you know, I have a niece, and I was involved in her education right from the beginning. When she came, you know, her parents had immigrated here to America. They came and stayed with me for a year. I converted my apartment to a Montessori classroom. I taught her reading, writing, arithmetic. She loved books. And she went to public school, but every time she would say, oh, physics is boring. She was now in Hartford. I would just drive there the next weekend and show her about how things move, and get her to see that that's what physics is. And when she got that on her own, and she's very, very hardworking, very curious, she picked up on that and she pursued it on her own. And I think like every kid deserves this, of have the mind open. So go ahead.
We're really fighting. We've actually found that our work is very well accepted by artists, musicians, carpenters, I mean, automotive people. I mean, it's amazing. Anybody who does things looks at our book and says, yeah, that's what I do. Even from fields that we have no examples of whatsoever. It's really astounding to us.
Business school.
Yeah, but the people we're having the most problem with are science teachers and science faculty at colleges. So, I mean, I just give you an example, which is exactly the kind of thing you were just mentioning. So at one point I was asked to address the Michigan Science Teachers Association. I was their keynote speaker. And at the time I was doing AIDS research, so I also gave a little seminar on that. The AIDS seminar was written up in their newsletter. My keynote speech was not mentioned at all. The keynote speech was actually about the problem you just mentioned. And it basically featured a story about my daughter. So she was very curious, very bright. She's gone on to become a scientist and a poet who's been published in the New Yorker and places like that. She's a phenomenal person. But she would also come home and say, this is boring, or I don't understand why we're doing this. And one of them had, like in 3rd grade or something, they're teaching kids about density. I'm like, what the heck are 3rd graders learning about density for? They should be having experience of the world and understanding how things work and stuff. But no, the way this was taught in the classroom and in the textbook was density is, the mass over the volume. So D equals M over V. And that's literally in the book for a person who's 8 years old or something. She's like, why am I learning this? And what does it mean? And yeah, she could solve all the problems, but it was pointless. And so I said, okay, go read this little book, which we happen to have a book about Archimedes. And it's a little kid's book, way below her level, maybe for a 5-year-old, but basically Archimedes gets into it has this problem of, he's given by the king of the crown, which was supposed to be pure gold, but the king thinks maybe the goldsmith took a lot of the gold and used, replaced it with lead. So, he's skimming, and how is he going to prove this? And Archimedes is the smartest guy in the area. So he says, Archimedes, figure this out. And, he spends weeks trying to figure it out, and he can't. And then one day he gets into the baths, and we probably all know this story. And bath water rises, and he realizes that he's displacing his volume. And so if he has a weight and a volume, we can get the density and, the whole thing. My daughter comes running back and is like, wow, so does this mean if I went out and found a rock in the backyard, we could figure out the density? We're like, yeah, so let's go do it. So if I had a piece of wood, could I, she's all excited about this. So I get up and I say, so let me explain to you the difference between what you're teaching in your textbook and what my daughter experienced using the tools for thinking. So, density equals mass over volume. What mental tools are you using? Abstracting. That's basically it. But what are we abstracting? You are not giving them anything to abstract, right? They've never observed anything. They don't know what mass is. They don't understand the relationship of mass to weight. They don't, they're not even old enough to calculate volumes because they haven't got any geometry or anything yet. So you're giving them all these concepts which link to absolutely nothing observable. All right, so now let's go back and try it through the tools for thinking. And, so you go through, it's embodied thinking, it's observing, it's abstracting, it's, finding patterns or, making leaps from this is the same, I can use this for anything the way my daughter did. It literally uses every single tool, including, this excitement, because you need to be excited and understand why it's a problem and why this is a solution and why it matters, all these. It's all there, and I lay this all out, and literally all the science teachers stare at me.
Wow.
There were no questions. There was no clapping at the end of it. They just looked at me like, what do you think you are asking us to do? Because, this isn't in the textbook, and it's not in the teacher's guide to how to teach it. And so
it's not what they learned in college.
No, they totally ignored it. And I'm just thinking, this is the problem. We have too many people teaching who can't do it themselves. I mean, they could not have reinvented density if they needed to, even though it's been around for 2,500 years.
Wow, wow, wow. The approach I have, I think the core thing is, as you said at the end, if you can't do it, you can't teach. You can't teach it. So, I mean, my kind of tentative solution to this problem is to find as many people who are able to think in this way, connect them all up, and have kind of these discussions over and over. And what happens is that there is a network effect of that. I mean, some of these, social systems are very large and they have a lot of inertia. There is all kinds of things that stop them. But what happens is that change kind of happens. What happens is that these structures look very big, right? Big hierarchical structure. Many times change happens at the bottom. So it's like there is a movement at the bottom. These are all kind of ossified structures. They're saying, oh, this is how science is to be taught. But the actual science actually ends up kind of going around it. I think with the internet, especially, and the kind of communication that is possible between people, there is a real education that is possible outside of the education system. And then it will seep into it over time. I think that's a much better, because what happens is that here you're reaching people who are actually hungry for it. Like for my meetups, that's what I found. People just show up from everywhere because they want to, they want to do this. They do this, they have been doing this. Go ahead.
I mean, you have to say that there are pockets of people in teaching. And teaching is not one monolithic, everything looks the same. There are definitely pockets of people working in certain ways that are, very relevant to what we're talking about. And I mean, one thing that comes to my mind on a sort of a graduate level is a guy who used to be at MSU and now he's at Arizona State. Punya Mishra. And he has assembled a team of graduate students over the years who've been looking at, for one of the things they've been doing, and they're very technologically oriented, trying to get teachers using the new technologies and the new medias. But the other thing that he has done with his students is look at the tools for thinking and try to see how they can apply these through new media, et cetera, to the classroom. And so, he's just steadily had his students, and now some of his students are now working in universities who are pursuing this kind of the emotional approach or the imaginative approach to teaching, not just science, but many different kinds of fields. So, there are small pockets of people who are, or some areas that have always been trying to do that.
Absolutely. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the thinking tools, and then again come back to the issue of education, because issue of education is close to all our hearts. That's I think that's so in terms of tools, let me just take a couple of minutes to summarize for folks. See, Bob and Michelle have done a fantastic job of mapping out all the tools. So there are tools. I'm just going to go through this in like 3 minutes. This is a 3-minute version. Please get the book, Sparks of Genius, and read it to yourself, but this is a 3-minute version of it. I'm going to give you the base tools, and I'm then going to ask them about higher level tools. Okay, so the base tools are observing, where you're observing of the world. Then you're imaging things, where you're trying to not only immediately observe it, but you have to be able to kind of bring into the mind of possibility of it being there. That is a crucial ability of being kind of able to visualize, to image things. Abstracting is a way of taking a pattern which is there, kind of simplifying it to its core, like we were talking about Cahal's example. Then there is a power of analogizing, of saying this is like that. There is a lot of processes that run on that process. Then there are things which are like body thinking, where you kind of like, especially for artists, but also for engineers or scientists, you kind of feel it in your body, because there are all the sources, as one of my favorite phrases of Leonardo, he calls it common sense. All the senses are together. So each sense actually helps you build up the picture and complete the picture and shows you sometimes what is missing. So there is body thinking, there is empathizing, kind of having kind of common deepness of value with something. You actually care about something, that makes a big difference. Then there is stuff about patterns, both of kind of recognizing patterns and of forming patterns. And the last one is that of kind of dimensional thinking, being, if something is two-dimensional, being able to kind of add a dimension to it, things like that. So those are the kind of base tools. This is a kind of a quick look at it. But then the beautiful thing I like about the structure of the book is that then they talk about these higher level tools like modeling or playing or transforming or synthesizing, which use multiple of this. Play, for example, is very interesting. When you actually look at works of scientists like Newton or people like that, there is a sense of play. There is a, curious, one of my favorite stories of Newton is that he used to measure storms by jumping towards the wind and away from the wind. And he actually measured what was the difference in how far he could jump. And that was his measurement of how strong the wind was. So something like that. So there is a sense of play to it. So let me focus on those last four. Let's start with the most complex one, and that is the synthesizing. What is synthesizing? Can you talk a little bit about synthesizing and how it brings together different tools?
So one of the critical things for us is sort of balancing reductionism, taking things apart into their pieces, but also putting it back together so that it forms something functional. So if anybody's ever taken apart a mechanical watch or clock, you know how easy it is to take it apart, each of the pieces. And you also know how complicated it is to put all those back together so they actually work again. So in a sense, that's what we tried to do, is break these things down, but then give you a sense of how they'll get put back together. And I think that's one of the problems that we have with education, is that we've taught everything separately. You get your English class and your math class and your science class and your geography class and whatever. Synthesizing probably is something that for me was always there for two reasons. So one is, and I don't know why this was true in the school I went to, it was a Los Angeles public school, elementary school. I don't remember subjects. We probably did have subjects, but for example, I remember a map drawing exercise where we had to draw from scratch the entire world. And then you had to label the different countries, and then you had to draw in on the countries what their major product was and where the capital was, and what the population was. And so, I mean, it was basically trying to pull together everything that you could know as a sixth grader and put it all into one big thing. And that's sort of what our synthesizing is all about, is at one level, it's putting together all the ways you have learned to know something. You've observed it, and you've abstracted out the essential components, and you've played with it, and maybe you've made a model with it, and the model lets you, sort of become the thing. So you're empathizing. And if you empathize completely, you feel in your body what it's like to be a plant, or what it's like to be the wind blowing in the storm. Or we literally had, physicists saying he became a neutron star in order to understand how it worked. I worked with Jonas Salk, who invented the first polio vaccine. He said, in order to understand polio, he became the polio virus to see what it wanted to do, and then he became the immune system to understand how it was going to respond to it, things like that. So they had to put these things all back together, and then at some point you have to transform them, which is one of our other tools. You have to transform them from this totally personal, embodied way of knowing something into a public form. And so it could be a piece of artwork if you're an artist, it could be a piece of music if you're a musician, it can be an experiment if you're a scientist, it could be an equation, whatever it happens to be. But you need to be able to publicly express that. And when we look at education, what we see is we are teaching those ways of making public expressions devoid of any of the material that goes behind it. So we teach people how to, do a piece of math. We don't tell them why. We just give them a problem we already know how to solve. We don't tell them when you use math or why you'd want to turn a problem into a piece of mathematics to solve it. We tell them to write something, but we've literally been in classrooms where people are told, write a poem. About what? What do you mean write a poem? Michele actually taught poetry in various classrooms. And, if you tell people, here's the subject, here's the form, and, here are the criteria by which it's going to be evaluated, they can write great poems. But if you literally just say, write a poem, everybody sits there and either gives you what they think you want, which is usually junk or something that they've read somewhere or trying to copy, or, and it's the same thing with math or anything else. I mean, if you don't know why you're doing it or what you're supposed to do, how can you do it? You can't. All right, so that's one half. The other half of that synthesizing is something we didn't write about in Sparks of Genius, which we'll go into something in the future, which we hadn't really thought about at that point or couldn't figure out how to put in. But this is something that I like to call problem-directed understanding or learning or problem solving, or I mean, we haven't determined a real term yet for it, but this is something I watched my parents do. I mean, particularly my father. My father was one of the very first computer programmers. So we're talking, 1950. They're inventing the first programming languages. What does a programmer do? Nobody knows. I mean, it's a totally new field. It's being invented. The language it's using to talk to the rest of the world and manipulate the computers are being invented at the time. So what does he do? I mean, he worked on dozens of different problems. I mean, he's one of the people who wrote the code that allows the U.S. Postal Service to scan an address and actually get to the right place. So he's one of the first people to, how do you take handwriting or printing and figure out what it means, whatever that means to a computer, so that it, directs it into the right mailbox. He worked on things like how do you model the best possible design for a rocket engine, the nozzle design and things like that. So every problem he worked on was a new problem. So what he told me when I was young was, you don't have to know everything, which I think is one of the mistakes we're making in education. What you have to know is how to define the problem clearly. What is the problem? And then you let the problem tell you what you have to know to solve it. Because if you have a good definition of the problem and it's well constructed, it will tell you this, you have to know in a case of a rocket, how hot is it? How much pressure does it build up? What are the, possible shapes you could make one in, da, 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 da. Now, you're not an expert. You're really good at writing equations and, you know the language to feed them into the computer. What do? You go off and you ask questions of experts. There's always somebody who knows something about the temperature, the flame coming out of the rocket. There's always somebody who knows something about geometries. There's always somebody. So knowing the right questions to ask becomes the critical thing. And so what we're doing is, in a sense, not failing our students by giving them questions that we already know the answer to, rather than saying, how do you ask a good question? And what makes a good question different from one that can't be answered, for example? And all right, now you've asked a good question. How do you go about figuring out how to get the material, the information, the skills, the tools, whatever it is that you need to solve that? Because lots of people working on the edges of any field are working in the unknown. The only thing they know is, here's what the challenge is, here's what the problem is. The rest of it, they're going to have to make up. And so we need to teach them those kinds of skills, which aren't there at all. So the questioning now becomes part of that synthesis. How do I take what I know to ask a good question? And then how does that tell me what I now need to do in order to assuage my ignorance?
That's beautiful. I mean, the thinker that I have learned most from on the general area that you've been talking about, is Louis Sullivan. His principle is form follows function. So in that sense, if you look at what has happened to science, is that people have forgotten the function of science. Right. Yeah. And they are just worshiping the forms. And when you do that, the function gets killed. Function of science is to ask the question, what is it? And proceed to answer it. If you don't ask the question, what is it? And instead, take the products of somebody else's work, the forms of their process, it's going to kill your ability to ask that question. Another one of his beautiful formulation is problem contains its own solution. Yes. So you ask what the problem is and keep focused on what the problem is. And that is, it's slowly the process of delimiting the problem, of saying where exactly the limits are, that is the thing that leads to the solution. That contains that, so problem contains the seed of the solution. Wonderful. So this is great. Now, I'm sure everybody is dying to ask you questions. So I'm going to take it to questions next. So folks, we've got 4 rules that we have used, rules of civility. Number 1, when you want to ask questions, type exclamation mark. I'll come to you. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. There are a lot of people who want to ask questions. Please be brief. Number 4, feel free to disagree with anything, speak your mind, but be courteous in doing that. All right, so let me open this up. Give me a second. All right, so first one up is Angela. Angela, go ahead.
Yes, so good to see you, Bob and Michelle. When I was writing my doctoral dissertation on modern day polymath, it became very clear to me, Bob, that you were the leading thinker in polymathy studies. And I really do consider you the forefather of this small, but hopefully growing field. And obviously you've been thinking about this and writing about it for decades now. I'm curious if in 2020, in the current context with, you know, we're in this knowledge economy, modern technology, the world's getting more and more complex. And so maybe old approaches don't work quite the same as they used to. I'm curious if you see any shift in how people receive your ideas in more recent years, or any more kind of relevancy in modern times as opposed to 10, 20, 30 years ago.
So on the one hand, relevancy, absolutely. I mean, I think the more complex we look at the, you know, problems that we're facing, you know, global warming, pandemics, I mean, all these things, you know, there are social issues, there are economic issues, there are political issues, there are religious, I mean, there are people who have religious views on all of these things. I mean, it's really quite astounding when you look at how they understand things through their own lenses and so forth. So I think it's extremely relevant. On the other hand, on the other hand, far from things getting easier to be a polymath, I mean, as you found in your own studies, people who are polymaths often hide the fact that they get met with lots of skepticism and problems if they, you know, try to admit that they're doing multiple things, or bring other information into their professional work and things like that. Michelle and I, far from, you know, despite the books we've written, Sparks of Genius and things like that, which you would think would sort of pave the way to doing more stuff, have both found that, at least in the, you know, academic and publishing world, it's much worse, or at least as bad as it's ever been. So Michelle wrote a book called Inventing Imaginary Worlds, which sort of came out of Sparks of Genius, where one of the things that we observed with lots of the people that were in the book were that they would invent an imaginary world as a teenager, which then would become sort of a springboard for their creativity as an adult. So Michelle's experience in trying to get published was that editors, like at both Oxford and Harvard University presses, were like, wow, this is a great book. Michelle did sort of the same thing that we've done in all of our books, which was to walk around the subject, you know, historically, and case studies and you know, statistical studies and, you know, all sorts of different approaches, and meld them together so that, you know, you get a view of, you know, the center from many different angles, because we're trying to implement the kinds of approaches we're talking about with synthetic thinking. And so the editors got this, but the review boards were like, okay, so one, we can't figure out where we're going to put this on the shelf in a bookstore, because it's not art, and it's not science, and it's not psychology, and it's not history. It's, you know, it's all these things put together. So we don't know how that was one problem. The other problem was professional. Yes, who is she?
She's an historian.
She's not
a psychologist.
Right. It went to the psychology in order to put it somewhere. The presses would put it in the psychology grouping. And then the professional psychologists who were reviewing the book for the press would say, we're not going to let this be published. She's not a professional psychologist. It's like, it's not supposed to be a professional psychology book, you dum-dums, you know. I just went through the same thing. I've been writing a book for the last 10 years on artists as scientists and inventors. So I've got case studies. I've got like 70, 80 case studies of people who were formally trained as artists, musicians, or performers, that most of them, this was their profession, and they have made major discoveries in the sciences or as inventors, which affect all of our daily lives. So those were the criteria. And, you know, so I've done all sorts of research. Some of it's original, some of it isn't. Some of these are, you know, they're known already, but, you know, nobody's really put them all together to show that there's a pattern here. So I put this all together, I send it in, and just to give you an example, MIT Press just turned it down. And the reason was exactly the same thing Michele ran into. Who the hell is this guy, said one of the board members. I mean, who does he think he is that he can do science and write a book about artists and, you know, musicians and people like that? One of the reviewers said, look, I've got graduate students who will spend their entire lives on one of these people. So what is he doing talking about 70 of them? And I'm like, you don't understand. One, nobody's done this before, okay? Half these people nobody knows about. They haven't linked them to the discovery or the invention they made. So this is original. No, I'm not trying to do the final thing on it. I'm just trying to open this up so other people will know that they're out there. And two, unless you have enough case studies, you can't see the patterns. Well, they didn't get any of this. And so, you know, it was rejected out of hand and basically, you know, no, I can't do the book. And I'm like, wow, that's strange because I already wrote it. and doing Sparks of Genius didn't help. I mean, it was literally like, you know, we've already done studies that are accepted across art, science, music, history, dance. You know, it's not like we don't have a track record. Made no difference whatsoever.
I have good news and bad news, Bob.
Yeah.
Publishing industry is dead.
Oh yeah, I know. It's
so that's
go online or something instead.
Yeah, that's a good news and bad news, because what happens is that the you know, these people who were the gatekeepers of what information got to people are gone now.
Yeah,
they some of them are still there, but the information is passing around them.
Yeah,
and with the combination of self-publishing capabilities, your own ability, even if a publisher publishes the book, their ability to help you with the book is almost zero.
Almost zero, I know. It's getting worse.
And it's a major negative, because you're giving away your rights to this other thing, which is organization, which is not something they want to deal with.
Yep.
So I've helped many authors. I love, you know, because I'm in publishing, I've helped many authors do. So I would be happy to talk to you about self-publishing, getting the book out there, coming up with a way of kind of marketing it online. You would have much better chance.
Yeah, no, it's clear that we need a completely different way of educating people and reaching people. And thank goodness that we're living in this age where the internet does exist and these can be invented.
Yes, exactly.
That answers Angela's question, but things are changing.
They're changing.
The way the Polymath will operate in the world, to the extent that they are still operating, always have been around and still will be, but the ways that they operate and get out there will have to change. Yeah.
Wonderful. So next up is going to be Kane, Jean, Mike. Kane, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I was wondering, I'm sorry I missed the beginning if this was covered, but I was wondering, you know, my boyfriend is a polymath and a genius, and I was wondering if you think that polymaths have to have a genius IQ or higher intellect, or if people can be polymaths without that, or what your experience was with that.
Well, I can start and you can. Okay. Well, basically what we understand and how we understand the information that's out there in the field is that there really is not a necessary connection between genius IQ and polymathy and polymathic achievement. In fact, IQ has very little to do with creativity in essence. So that, I guess that's the short answer. Is there a longer answer to that?
Basically, there have been many studies above about 115 IQ, which is the average for somebody who goes to college. There's literally no correlation with achievement, creative ability, or anything else that anybody's ever found. I've actually managed to come up with about 6 Nobel Prize winners whose IQ were in the 120s range. So you can get a Nobel Prize without even having an unusual IQ. On the other hand, there are also studies of people who have extraordinary IQs. The most famous is Terman, who basically studied only people whose IQs were over 140. He had another subgroup of over 180. And he was very shocked, and people have actually followed this up 50 and 60 years later to find that their careers were quite average. They were no different than anybody else who went to college. So
they didn't have particularly creative outcomes.
No.
In that group of people, which they were expecting. They were expecting that these kids would grow into, a huge rank of creative geniuses, but they didn't.
So on the other hand, addressing your boyfriend, that doesn't mean that, IQ is a bad thing. Obviously, having a great memory and the ability to learn many things quickly and so forth is going to be a tremendous advantage if you also have the other skill, the creative skills to go with it and put it together. So there are definitely, lots of genius polymaths out there as well. So.
Okay, next up is going to be Jean. Jean, go ahead. Jean, you need to unmute.
Thank you so much. I joined Angela's presentation last time. I was very excited. And she mentioned on the Facebook group, you are the one who actually first discovered this polymath. And it has been haunting me all my life because I'm interested in all different areas. And it seems people actually comments on me, like you have too much things to show on your Instagram. People just show cooking every day or drawing. So like you cooking, drawing your kids, like too much going on. They don't like that. But anyway, and today's talk, you really showed why my kids is so bored at school. And he complains, he loves science, but science class is so boring. And I wonder, actually, after I hear you talk, I wonder the reason you get so many obstacles in this discovery, because the structure, what Jordan Peterson said about this hierarchy of this structure we built in society, like I'm an architect. I know my partner who was a designer for 20, 30 years, he couldn't get architect license. He has to have me to stamp the drawing, even though he knows more than me about the drawing because he started as a builder. So this actually shows the reason, because they build this hierarchy to exclude people without certain credential to be able to find discoveries. And this is actually a hierarchy society. And what your discovery, you actually break it. So I wonder that's the reason, this have so much obstacle, but because of internet, it actually break it down, like the publishing, publishing company, like you can publish yourself. But so I just wonder, I think there's a great opportunity for this, I really interested to join this group study about the book you're writing. And I'm trying to figure out how to change the education for my kids, for them to have the creative outlet, instead of, because I know people graduate
yes.
to college, but they can't really find a job. I don't want to be in that boat. I don't want to pay so much for my kids get education they can't really use in their work. So I want my kids to do the things they love and be creative. So
Jean, we have to keep it brief. You always have great comments, but let's keep it brief. Go ahead, Bob and Michelle.
So one thing I would pass along is something my grandfather said probably when I was like 5 years old or something, and we were visiting, and I must have said something like, "Grandpa, I'm bored." And he said, "No one with a functioning brain is ever bored." And what he was really saying was, sure, I could have been bored to death in school. I was much smarter than almost everybody else in my classes. And there was one kid who was also very smart. He'd finish everything and then he'd get in trouble because he'd do all sorts of stupid things, right? My approach was, when I finished the homework, then I started thinking, or whatever we had to do, I started thinking about how it connected to everything else. So one of the things I think that's wrong with education is simply that we don't encourage bright kids to go off and now think on their own. And they can do this in their head. Your son doesn't need to sit there and be bored. He can use whatever he just learned as a springboard to connect to everything else. He can imagine a world in his head that he goes into when, you know, he doesn't need to think about school. He's done, everybody else is still working, you know, so he builds this imaginary world where he invents things which, you know, he can come home and build on his spare time or whatever it is. There are lots of positive things that can be done. And that's a really critical skill to learn, because as a polymath, I can tell you that there are always lots of things that I would like to be doing and I can't. And you have to learn how to prioritize. One of them is just to have a job. I mean, I need to have a job so I can bring in the money so I can do the other things. And no, I don't like everything about my job, but dealing with that is part of surviving in the world too.
Yeah, I could just add to that, you know, with reference to education of the young. I think sometimes we also, as parents or whatever, or as society, we expect that the school is going to do it all. They're going to educate, they're going to do all the education that a human being needs. And I don't think we should look at it that way. I think a lot of your education has to be self-driven, self-motivated, has to be, you know, we have to create or allow our children time to be autodidacts, to learn what they want to learn. And that, you know, I mean, in the present situation, that's what happens mostly outside of school time. So there are ways to encourage children to have the time to explore their interests and develop avocations that are, you know, not directly related to what they're learning in school, but interestingly will probably have a lot of connections. Like if they invent an imaginary world, they'll have in that world all the things they've been learning in school, but transposed into their own world. And so the more you can encourage your children to not just to give them one activity after another that's driven by the adults, it's a given activity to them, but give them time to explore something on their own. They have to create the activity on their own, and they'll own it, and they'll be creative within that in the ways that interest them.
I just want to make a side comment. I think education differs from culture to culture. I grew up in India, where education is revered, and teachers are revered. And so, for example, I had really good teachers. So it's like, you know, I was at the head of class. So many teachers would come in and say, this is the assignment for everybody. This is the assignment for you and you. And they would do the work of actually coming up with assignments for us on a daily basis. So it's, I think even the kind of approach of what education is different. And so that the philosophy of education, value of education in the culture also matters. Next up is going to be Mike M, followed by Mike S, Jose, Laura, Chris, and Natalia. Mike, go ahead.
Okay. I saw your presentation at the National Academy of Sciences, their culture program several years ago, and that was memorable. The question I have is, one thing that Leonardo da Vinci, Edison, and Feynman had in common was they told themselves, they were able to tell themselves in their mind a story as to what their particular activity or project was about, and the innuendos of it, and to score these alternate stories very quickly. And that's how they came up with their apparent creativity. Have you thought in terms of the neuroscience as to how that internal process works in your paradigm?
So no, we haven't. Much as neuroscience has developed in the last 20 or 30 years, there was actually a major conference, I don't know, it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago at Johns Hopkins, where they brought together top educators and top neuroscientists and said, what can the neuroscience tell us about education that we don't already know? And the answer was nothing. So basically, we could go into the neuroscience and tell you that when you are creating, as we have suggested with synthetic thinking, your whole brain lights up, but that really doesn't tell us anything other than what we already know, which is you're synthesizing everything you know and using your feelings and body as well as your intellect. At this point, we don't feel the neuroscience really does much in terms of providing insights, and we're pretty much ignoring it.
What about the story you tell yourself, though?
Okay.
Well, I don't know that there's anything in the neuroscience that tells us about storytelling. I mean, again, there are MRI studies and things like that of people making up stories, professional storytellers, the entire brain lights up. Somebody who's never told a story before or written something, only the lexical areas will light up because they're so focused on finding the right word. But that just means that, people who don't have the tools have to focus on specific things like what word am I using and is this grammatical, whereas people who are telling professional storytellers are using, the whole thing. I don't think any of that tells us what makes a Feynman different than like his sister, who was just as smart and also a physicist. He told her to tell stories to herself. Maybe she did. Maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it's not sufficient. Maybe the stories work the best, but I don't know that neuroscience can tell us much about that.
Okay, next up is Michael S.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm just thinking, like, I've spent my whole life not fitting in and not getting what I wanted, and consequently I spent the last 8 to 9 years approximately catching up with the things I never learned as young. But what do you see as an opportunity for a whole world now that we have internet and stuff, scaling up the learning and the experimentation and the talk about polymaths? I'm a part of a fairly large number of circles and groups talking about this, but they're small in comparison to the society as a whole. But how do we get this conversation to a broader level?
Yeah, well, the best thing I can say, and I mean, Angela's in on this and various other people, that we're getting more and more emails and contacts of various sorts from people who have stories exactly like yours, and they're asking exactly the same question. And what we're doing is sharing those contacts with each other and sort of saying, okay, here are the other people we know who are dealing with the same issues and the same challenges. And I think at some point we're going to hit a tipping point because, just in the last year or so, there's just been a huge upsurge in the interest in polymaths and people with general skills and so forth, and questions like Angela asked earlier. What can we do with such people? Where do they fit in? Part of what Michele and I are doing right now is formal research, trying to look at where people like this have been useful and successful in the past. Just to give you one example, everybody knows Robert Oppenheimer, and everybody knows, Edward Teller as the inventors of the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb, and they get all the credit for doing all the work. And the reality is that there was a second in command in each of those situations who was an extraordinary polymath, who was the person who had all the language and the skills, and they were like you. They didn't fit in. They didn't have an obvious career path. They didn't know what they were going to do. But in the context of this huge challenge of how do we develop this incredible new technology, and maybe it's for uses we don't particularly like here, but find a way to use it in some way. They needed people who could talk to the engineers, the physicists, the mathematicians, the metallurgists, everybody. And these people who right now seem fairly marginal were literally critical to these functions. And what I see wrong with what's going on for example, with our pandemic responses across the world is we don't have people like this at the top helping to integrate. So everybody's running off. Yeah, there are 172 different groups trying to create vaccines. That's stupid. We need somebody who's sitting there looking at all 172 different approaches and saying, there's really only 3 approaches here. Why do we have multiple people doing exactly the same thing in, multiple ways, whatever? We could be much more efficient and so forth, but there's nobody who even sees the picture at this point. Very scary. I think eventually we're going to, people are going to realize how important polymathy is.
Michael, the only thing I would add is that you're always welcome here. We do this every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern time and every Sunday. So the whole bunch of polymaths on different topics come and present and talk to each other about this. So you're always welcome. Next up is going to be Jose, Laura, Chris, Natalia, and Kavita. Jose, go ahead.
Yes, a very quick question. As a high-functioning Asperger, I found there's many Aspergers that are polymath. Do you have any comment or know about any research or maybe in your books?
So as far as I know, no research. Maybe Angela knows. I haven't come across any, but I'm certainly hearing what you're saying more and more often. So I think it's something we definitely need to look into. And I think in part, one of the things that we got a lot of responses from Asperger's, from people who had other kinds of what are called intellectual challenges or whatever, when we came up with Sparks of Genius. And the interesting thing is that people in these groups tend to be much more empathetic and embodied than other groups of people. So, you can be a great student and get straight A's and succeed in classrooms with, just following pure intellectual stuff. But there's something about thinking in different ways, knowing the world in different ways, which ends up being creatively extremely useful. So yeah, definitely something we should be looking at.
Yeah, and I also thought when I was studying Inventing Imaginary Worlds, there was definitely, whether it was a subgroup or not, but there were definitely a strong link between Asperger's and Inventing Imaginary Worlds. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Laura.
Hi. Well, what you're talking about is something I've lived and breathed in my academic life and my corporation life, and I still think about it all the time. The nature of the how part is fundamental to learning, and I think that is fundamentally where we go wrong in education, is we don't teach the kids the how. We never teach them how to learn, how to think, how to ask the question, how, what's here, what's given, what do I know? And until we do that, we don't empower them with the way. And when they have the way, they have the will. There's no doubt about it. And I wish I was affiliated again with a university and doing this work, because I would do it every minute of every day, because I think we need to reinvent schools and we need to reinvent learning. And part of it is starting that with the core and moving out to what you're talking about, the different levels, the different things. I worked basically, mine was based on Polya's art of problem solving. You were aware of that book, right?
Yep.
It's a little book also, which has a lot of power. And I use that and as my basis because it fit well. But I asked, and when I worked with kids, I wound up having to counsel them. And I used to use that, ask those questions and talk to them about their interests and showed them how that bit of what was affiliated with math went to every subject. So I have to be short. And I just say, I wish I could, if you need a helper, I'd be happy to help in any way to pass this out, to give it out to the world, because I'm still absolutely enthused by it. I wrote a little book called Quantitative Learning Through Algebra, which has a lot of problems and worked examples and examples for kids to solve where they always had to become a piece of the problem, which and made them so enthused. It was incredible. Anyway, thank you so much. This has been a sheer delight.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, there is a recent study I saw by somebody who said, basically, I figured out how to teach every student to like math. And it sounds like he was doing very much what you did. I mean, he made everybody in the classroom ask questions. He didn't want answers. You weren't allowed to give answers if you knew the answer to the problem. What's the problem about? How do you think about the problem? What are the boundary conditions? What tools would you bring to it? how do you feel about it? You know, how do you be, you know, how would you be embody the question and so forth? And when he did that, students who claimed they hated math, all of a sudden were like, oh, wow, this is really cool. I could do this.
Well,
Yeah,
Laura, we are going to run out of time. So I want to have other 4 people be able to ask their questions. Next up is going to be, give me just a second. It's going to be Chris, Natalia, Kavita, and Ping. Chris, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this. I was curious if you have seen, or do you see a connection between valedictorians, because they tend to be quite well-rounded. They do the arts, they do music, they're on the varsity team. And then when you look at the longitudinal studies, if I recall, they typically were actually quite successful long-term when you look at them 20, 30, 40 years later. And I'm curious if you've looked at that subgroup, because they seem to be kind of a self-selected group that fits in with that definition.
Yeah, so not explicitly with valedictorians. We did a study here at Michigan State where we looked at the Honors College. And so the Honors College people, most of them are valedictorians from their high school classes. They fit exactly the profile you're talking about. And very high rates. So we were looking at science graduates specifically, but we wanted to know, you know, were they doing the arts? Were they doing music? Were they, you know, being creative in other ways? Did this correlate with their success at their, you know, their science or technology careers? And the answer was yes, in all these cases, very high rates of continuing to do artwork throughout their lives, or music, or writing poetry, or, you know, plays, or whatever it happened to be. They had very high rates of patents compared to control groups. They had, you know, very high rates of publications, honors, all those kinds of things. So yeah, people who are very well-rounded tend to have the skills to be successful at whatever they go into.
Okay, last 3 questions from Natalia, Kavita, and Ping. Natalia, go ahead. Natalia, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, next up is, go ahead.
Can you see me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you see me if I go to my document?
No, we don't have time for document. We can just go ahead.
No. It's just for me to read. I don't have a question, but I wanted to just mention really quickly to actually my question is if the authors have been working on maybe like the understanding of the concept of connectedness in the 21st century. I think that the fact that when we're talking about abroad, different fields of learning and experimenting, we're experiencing also connecting globally, we're experiencing at the same time a collapse in connections when everything is more and more specialized. Groups, when we're connected around the world, at the same time, we are not connected in communities. We are not connected, we're connected through professions. Children are connected through age. In education, STEM is more used than art and languages, which the programs are suffering. Humanities is disappearing. So we're getting like more and more specialization and less fact of interconnectedness and understanding, and that all the fields are connected. And it becomes kind of the parts without the relationship to the whole. And in education, it makes me think also of when we talk about Renaissance education for the elite, of course, but in regards to Leonardo da Vinci, coming from Europe, we always had a sense that we, in order to have, we talk about a broad range of education, being in art and science and everything, as a part of knowledge. But the fact that my question was the thinking that the fact that actually it mirrors what we're experiencing through this new technology and the way we communicate, is that actually while we think it's connecting us, it also kind of disconnect us in a way and bring us collapsing onto ourselves.
Well, that's the paradox, I think, and that's something that I think that polymaths and generalists are always going to have to fight against, because it's actually human nature, I think, to to connect with those who, you know, who are mirroring your own interests and values. And so, and also we have these structures that are ingrained in our societies, the specialization, the professionalization, the way we educate on a sort of industrial model. I mean, these things are all, they're not going to go away. I mean, I think it's just, it is a fight constantly to try to make the connection work in other ways as well.
I think what we need to do is realize we need both. Or, you know, we need many people with many different kinds of skills, and they're going to work at different levels and in different ways. If everybody knew exactly the same thing and worked in the same way, then you're all interchangeable. And that doesn't get us anywhere. One thing you said, which I want to sort of just pick up on, is something about, you know, Renaissance education, particularly for the elites. One of the things that I found when I was looking at these artists as scientists and inventors was quite striking to me, which was that about 10 to 15% of the cases that I dug up were people who were not good students. In fact, there are two of them who invented new geometries. One of them actually flunked standard geometry 3 times. The other basically barely passed with a D. And yet, as adults, they invented new geometries. They did it through their art by being extremely highly visual. They did not know how to put it into standard geometric forms and had to end up collaborating with a mathematician in order to translate it for the mathematicians. But I think we have to be wary of saying you have to be really smart in order to take advantage of, you know, a Renaissance education. A Renaissance education may in fact be the key to capturing skills and, you know, potentials in people who the normal educational system is leaving out, because these people would never have gotten into STEM, you know, through the normal channels.
Thank you. Next up is Kavita, followed by Ping. Kavita, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor and privilege to be here and listening to you folks. My first question is, can someone call themselves a polymath just knowing that they have varied interests, or they have to be accomplished, or is there a set of standard or scale to measure someone to be a polymath? And my second question, which is followed by, it's about my personal thing, because I always had interest in doing so many things while I was young, but I had to focus on my studies to get to earn a living. So now I try to learn music, dance and art. I try to do a lot at the same time. I kind of juggle between all these skills. And I just kind of feel that I have an imposter syndrome, that I'm trying to push myself into something that I'm not. So do people feel that way in any, part of their lives? That's my question.
So starting with imposter syndrome, I guess Angela could actually answer this better than we have, because she's done probably the critical study here. I think all polymaths and probably most creative people have imposter syndrome. That's just part of pushing beyond the boundaries of what you can already do and know. Yeah. So it's actually a great sign.
Yeah, I don't think there's any particular standard you have to reach to consider yourself a polymath, or to have polymathic inclinations or purposes or goals, because, you know, you're not finished yet. You don't know where life is going to lead you, or where all your interests are going to lead you. And what part of our definition, I think, that I mentioned in the beginning, which I didn't really throw in there, is that we're looking at networks of interest that develop over a lifetime. You know, so someone may do something, spend a lot of time in the arts when they're in their 20s, and then life leads them in different directions, and in their 40s they're doing, you know, they're inventing things, they're being more technological, and it's the interests that have developed over their lifetime that all go in to feed what they're doing at the present moment. So I'd say there's no standard, and part of that is that it doesn't all have to be on a professional level. You know, you have these networks of avocations that can be just very personal. You're pursuing them for your own your own interest, your own good, and you don't necessarily ever let anybody know. And yet they are feeding, you know, your creative potential in your profession, for instance.
Yep. So Natalie put up a quick thing saying, what syndrome? It's the imposter syndrome. Feeling like you are an imposter, you don't really
have the
fit,
skills,
you're not an expert. That's actually for a polymath a great thing, because you're never an expert. And if you're being creative, you're probably out there defining something totally new. So there aren't any experts at all.
And next question is from Ping. Ping, go ahead. You need to,
I unmuted myself. Okay, thank you very much for this honor to ask a question. I'm really enjoying your talk. My question is, you mentioned about as a children, our learning, the school is limited, the teacher's ability to teach is limited. So in order to, the solution is to go around it, to teach yourself, and the family education is also. But what about as adult? Because Polymath can offer a lot, and they have a broad range of interest and skills and talents. But how about when you have to survive? You mentioned it very briefly earlier, but I would like you to go a little bit more in depth. But when you, in order to survive, you know, how you have gatekeeper as well, you know, not just the publisher for your book, but gatekeeper as human resource person. In fact, the first person see your resume is actually computer, the keyword search, right? And also the very low rank HR person who does not have this critical thinking, making the connection of the. So how do you pass through all these gatekeeper and land in a fantastic job?
You lie. Yeah. You lie. I mean, literally. I mean, I think a lot of polymaths, and certainly I did this in my career, I did not put my artwork, I did not talk, you know, put any of the things that had to do with studies of polymaths, I mean, all sorts of stuff for the first probably 10 or 15 years of my career. It was a big deal for me to, you know, come out. It's like coming out of the closet, of any kind of closet. I mean, and I still, so, you know, we're being interviewed here. Michelle's never had a formal job. I mean, she taught incidental stuff here and there, but in part I managed because I got a MacArthur Fellowship, which gave me 5 free years to sort of do what I wanted. So that's what I did. I was basically unemployed the entire time because I knew what I wanted to do, and literally I could not find a job. It took me 7 years to find a job. So then I did what I had to do. I found a job where I have enough freedom. I can do the things I want. I'm now out of the closet, if you will. But half of my work is still not counted by my department. So none of my books have ever been counted as an accomplishment by my college or my university. Half my peer-reviewed publications are not, although it's really bizarre. In the last year, I've been in the proceedings of the National Academies, Science and Nature, which are, you know, the big 3 that everybody wants to get a publication in. And my department said, yes, but those are in, you know, polymathy, creativity studies. Therefore, they're not your science. You're a scientist. We don't count those. So I get, you know, below average ratings every year in my department, and I'm the most famous person in the department. That's just, I mean, that's part of living with doing the kinds of things that I do. Angela's actually documented this for, you know, a whole bunch of people. It certainly fits the biographies and autobiographies I've read of people. I had, in part, one of the reasons I did the history of this stuff was to prepare myself for this. So there are several people I read. J.H. Van Hoff was the first Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. He was also a semi-professional flautist. He wrote poetry that was published in 4 languages. He was a fine artist. He actually opened something like 7 different scientific fields. Physical geography, physical geology, biophysical, whatever. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. He was constantly considered to be, you know, a nobody, a failure, or whatever. He ends up with the first Nobel Prize. I remember interviewing a guy when I was a postdoc, a guy named Bob Hawley, who discovered transfer RNA. He was then working on his 6th new field. And I said, well, you know, what drives you? He says, beauty and challenge, you know, taking a risk. And so every 5 to 7 years, he would change completely the research field he was in. He would go, he said, I'm a pioneer. I will not work where there's more than 2 other people working in the field. So as soon as 2 or 3 other people started working, he'd jettison it and go off on something else. He had a Nobel Prize. He'd done this 6 times before, and he still couldn't get funding. And he said, how many times do I have to do this before people begin to realize that I have a track record and I can succeed? And the answer was, it didn't matter how many times he did it. We're so specialized. So even the people who are what we would consider to be extremely successful and at the very top of their field, who want to continue to broaden out and do new things, are going to run into this. And so in a sense, this is the challenge. And so this survival thing is, in my case, finding a place where I have enough free time to do the other stuff. I'm willing to take lower pay and, you know, less kudos, because guess what? I get paid a lot of money and I get to go first class to Korea because they like what I'm doing. Or, you know, there are other benefits which I find, you know, more than offset the daily junk.
Wonderful. So on that note, we are going to now move to the takeaway section. We're going to skip the breakout rooms because, you know, I didn't want to interrupt these amazing questions. But now it's time for our takeaways. So each person gets about 2 minutes to talk about what are they walking away with from this meetup. So I'm going to call on people in the order in which I see them on the screen. If you do not want to share your takeaways, you can just put skip in the chat and I'll skip you. So the first one up is Jose, Kavita, and Ping. Jose, go ahead.
Yes, great meeting today. Is just validate what I learned in 1982 when I found out that I was polymath, because the college that I'm at, Berklee College of Music, they decided to open a dual major on music production and engineering. So it was unique. And from that, I built all my business model based on my polymathy. So I'm doing digital marketing. So I do production, photography, video, web design, music. So everything is together. So it works, and I found the business model to it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be, let me see, I forgot. Okay, Kavita, you're next.
Yes, I'm just so excited to read the Sparks of Genius. I can't just wait to get that book because I really need to put my life in order. And I was thinking if I could have some tools to organize stuff and, you know, to help this thing going on to make things life better for me. So that would be my takeaway. Thank you.
Excellent, Kavita. Get it soon because we're going to be starting to study it soon. Next up is going to be Ping, Johanna, and Kurt.
Okay, so this question is we need to say the take home
Not
message.
question. Yeah, what we're doing now is that we're saying, what are we walking away? What did we learn in this? What did you learn from this meetup? And you got about 1 to 2 minutes to summarize it.
Okay, what I learned is I'm glad I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who suffered. That's it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Next up is Johanna. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Johanna. So my takeaway is I feel kind of a little bit more reassured. I'm a poet, painter, sociologist who's working in clinical studies. And I found myself going, why aren't they asking this question? There's data here. Because I'm constantly looking at the questions that people aren't asking, or the fact that there's more that we could dig. And I'm in an industry that's looking just at the medicine. and not why people aren't taking the medicine or what their other blocks are, or, you know, the social stuff, the social aspects. So I feel like all the things that have made me look at the world differently have like really helped me. But I'm also realizing that I want to make sure that I'm focusing more in one direction. And I think I've done that to some degree because sociology kind of demands that, but that there could be a little bit more focus and like integrating all of those things and creating like a skill set that works and modeling that. So.
Thank you, Johanna. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next up is Kurt, Natalie, and Michael. Kurt, go ahead.
Well, thank you for letting me participate in this. This is finally, I've met somebody sort of like me. I've been a polymath, I guess, all my life because I've been in all kinds of sports. I've been interested in all kinds of different sciences and history and everything. And that's why I developed a PE program at Van Nuys Middle School, a ghetto school in Los Angeles. It's all about using the labyrinth and using that in different ways for interdisciplinary work, and to be able to bring it so that it's agility drill, and so it brings so much to life. And that's why I ultimately started an Institute of Sports Psychology and Success Systems International. It's Success Systems. So there's people like me here. Look at you. I mean, my God, I'm so happy. And we're going to change this bloody world because we get to come from our hearts and make it so it's going to work instead of this other mierda, because we're going to focus on what we want rather than what we don't want. So I'm very happy. Thank you for getting me connected, Michael. Cillian did that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kurt. Next up is Natalie, Michael, Cillian, and Kane.
Oh, yes. I didn't say much about myself, but me too. I just realized I'm a polymath. It's very new. I started in theater, art, philosophy, and when my son was born, I went completely crazy for nature and science. And I thought that was not interesting, and everything just came together in this interconnectedness of what I call dot to dot everything. This is what I use in my classes. There are just a few things that you helped me as I'm taking notes. This whole conversation helped me define issues that we are confronting with in the 21st century, which is the ability to ask questions, to create the right environment for it, and the ability, and hence find solutions, and the ability to connect. Again, that's what I was saying. Connect knowledge, connect fields, connect people, connect questions, just the connectedness, especially when it comes to education with kids. I hear them saying a lot, bored. I didn't think we used to say that a lot when we were growing up, but I think also in what I realized, thanks to this conversation, what I witnessed with young adults in college, formerly community college level, become totally unprepared because they're obsessed with directions, but now they're obsessed with directions, but on top of it, we have to provide a deduction for them. They're unable now, and we're noticing this pattern, this shift, that we don't know if it's technology or anything, but the fact that they are not able to deduce, to explore on their own, and it creates a lot of anxiety for them. It's almost like we have to give them the answers for it. So I think that the ability to ask questions and the ability to connect is
wonderful.
Great.
Thank you, Natalie. Next up is Michael, Kane, and Eric. Michael Cillian, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. A fantastic conversation. Great that I can bring Kurt and everything. And I'm certainly looking for every way possible all over the world to further the studies and start maybe schools and academies for polymaths and navigators. And I'm currently looking for work myself, and I put together a very colorful, playful CV PDF that I can share in LinkedIn if you want to see like the opposite of not lying about.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. Anybody who wants to collaborate on this, we are looking for polymaths, okay?
Yeah.
To do both presentations, to talk to each other, maybe see what we can do together. Write to me at 52livingideas@gmail.com. 52livingideas@gmail.com. And let's see what we can do. We are already doing stuff. We're already meeting twice a week, so we can scale it up very easily. Next up is Kane Eric, and Laura.
Thank you. Okay, so I would say my biggest takeaway from this is I'm just kind of upset, really. I don't think we should live in a world where people like Bob aren't seen as accomplished because books are written outside the focus. I don't think we should live in a world where everyone on this call feels alone and isolated and not know how to articulate their polymathia because the world just isn't used to that word. So what I'm working on, and I get to actually work with Angela, is, you know, trying to create an opportunity for more polymaths to come together and actually get the respect that you guys deserve. So I'm very grateful to be a part of this call and hope to be a part of a lot more because, you know, you guys deserve your time in the sun, in my opinion. And since I'm not a polymath, I can stand on the outside and go to battle for all of you. And let's just make this happen.
Excellent. Next up is Eric, Laura, and Joel. Eric, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks. This was a very interesting presentation. I read the book Sparks of Genius a while ago, and I thought it was absolutely great. Some of the things that I'm coming away with is I think that there's a lot of resistance to this way of operating the world, and it definitely opened my eyes to the struggles that other people are having who have this kind of more holistic way of operating the world and not so specialized and fixed. And I can feel that there's a lot of frustration when you try to be this kind of person in this world. And I find myself often getting very frustrated and thinking like, why are these other people who don't think this way, why are they so stupid? Or how do they not see things the way that seems so obvious to me? And I think it inspires me to want to think more about this question of how do you operate with kind of more fixed mindsets and people who have a very rigid way of thinking. Because I think at some point, even going around the systems, you'll still at some point have to deal with them and figure out a more productive way to work with them instead of constantly fighting. So yeah.
Thank you, Eric. Next up is Laura, Joel, and Sharon. Laura, go ahead.
Okay, I think that to get this to happen, it has to be sold to, you know, the schools of school board or bigger than that even. And in order to do that, I think you have to have some material, some sense of curriculum that would work with this so that they would see how it could be brought into their schools. So I think, you know, you have to start thinking about what materials would look like, what would the actual material that the teachers would have to teach with, because, you know, right now it's a great idea, but it doesn't fit with most of the materials that teachers have to teach with. So I think you have to start to think about what your school might look like using this kind of thing, or what schools might look like using it on a broader base, and how it would be, you know, extended, and, you know, it could be, you know, and also what it would look like on an interdisciplinary level, so that what your school, you know, schools would look like, how your various schools would be interrelated. And I know I can't talk more than that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Just one really quick thing to remind everybody that there is a guy who's doing this named Punya Mishra, who's at University of Arizona, or Arizona State University. And there's also a movement called STEAM. So it's STEM education with arts added in. And there's a huge movement on this, which is developing curriculum right now. So some of this is starting.
Excellent. I will reach out to Punya and see what he has to say. I would love to have him here as well. Next up is going to be Joel, Sharon, and Marco. Joel, go ahead. Joel, are you there? Okay, next up is Sharon D.
Hi, thank you so much. I just, my takeaways, the things that I thought were so interesting about this was the idea of knowledge being gained. Well, first, the first thing, the distinction between knowing things and understanding things. And then the second thing is gaining understanding through tactile or through bodily sense rather than just intellectual sense. I thought those were just two great points really to think about. And that's it. I'll let the next person go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sharon. Next up is Jeff, Kavita, and Mike M. Jeff, go ahead.
So this was just really terrific, and I want to thank you for doing it. I've spent a lot of time over the years, both looking at the relationship between what things are as a thing, what they are unto themselves, and then what is beyond them, and then looking at the relationship and between, and in that innovation seems to happen at the seams between things as well as then within them. But this principle of always seeing things as at least integrated between three different fields or vantage points, now, the future, and the relationship, me, you, and our relationship. Seeing things in threes at a minimum is just essential. But you'd be amazed, and I know you wouldn't be amazed at how unique that criteria is for looking at any situation. So thank you so much. I really appreciated this time.
Thank you, Jeff. Next up is Khaled, followed by Mike. Khaled, go ahead. Okay, next up is Mike. Mike, go ahead.
The polymath that I admired growing up was Isaac Asimov. He wrote an important book in every single category of the Dewey Decimal System. It was considered a major book. The problems that remain are big, so that are big enough that collaborative teams need to be of specialists and generalists need to be created and need to know how to work efficiently together, and that's an area that is fraught with pitfalls because many of the experts become kind of divas that and don't work together well with others. So Bell Labs was an attempt in that area, but it's gone. So my challenge, I think, is how to create teams of people that become polymaths, not only with people, but with artificial intelligence engines to solve the remaining problems in our world.
That's a fantastic point, Mike.
Okay. Okay. Can I?
Yes, Khaled, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. My mic was closed. Thanks for this to be in this meeting. I started with fine arts study. Then at the university time, I studied physics. And once I finished the study of physics, fortunately, my experience was in the computer as a programmer. I learned from this that at physics, when I studied physics, I utilized the arts imagination in study physics, and after that I finished at the computer when I was a programmer.
Khaled, we are running out of time. We have the next meetup coming up. Can you summarize what you got from the meetup in 1 or 2 sentences?
Yes. The most motivation of the person to be a polymath as the creativity of the person, the creativity attitude of the person.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Angela. Angela, go ahead.
Yeah, so for me, you know, the takeaways, some of them I already knew, but just that Bob and Michele are real revolutionaries. They really paved the way for polymathy studies, and, you know, so much of why I had a lot of resources in my dissertation due to their work. So they're legends to me, really. And it's an honor to have known them and even presented with them at some conferences. Other takeaways are just how much this topic resonates with people. Like, you really sense it when you get in a setting like this and hear from people. The difficulties polymaths face, in my opinion, are not necessary. It's just the societal context, the systems, the cultures, the biases that are in place right now, which can change. We still have so much more work to do in order to leverage the power of polymaths. As Bob pointed out, it's kind of dangerous if we don't change. And so just so much more discourse and a culture shift is necessary.
Excellent. My takeaways is that I love this book, and after this conversation, I love it even more. And from seeing all the feedback that we've gotten, I think I'm just going to we are just going to do this book. So we're going to go through the book, and we're going to see what we can learn from each other, because the great thing here is that we have something more than the book. We have ourselves, all of us, committed to doing this. So we'll actually be able to talk about how these tools work in each of us, and what our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, how do we compensate for them, how do we work together in order to do more. So there is a level of discussion that we can do about this book, which is much deeper than what you could normally get from a book. So I'm looking forward to doing that. Bob and Michele, what are your takeaways?
Mine is that the community is growing. It's astounding to see everybody here. It's just great to see all the connections. It's really sad to hear how many of you have felt isolated and disenfranchised. And as Angela said, we have to do something about that.
Michele?
I don't think I can really add to that. This was a new experience for me. I've never participated in this kind of broad discussion with a broad people from anywhere. I take it you can be anybody anywhere and join in
Exactly.
the conversation, which
Exactly.
I think is terrific.
Exactly.
And this is really the first time I've participated in something like that. I think it's a great forum for discussing ideas and hopefully for creating some change.
Absolutely. So really look forward to the change. I think Buckminster Fuller or people like Louis Sullivan, they believe that this is something that is each individual's, each child's, core ability, that each of us has the ability to do that. And that's what is happening now with this new medium. There is a chance that all of us can find each other, talk to each other, and learn from each other. So thank you so much. This has been an honor and a delight. So love to have you back at some point. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.